We believe when we have international engagements, we have a couple of roles. One is obviously we benefit tremendously from the talent of students coming to UCLA and our students going to institutions. But we also think it builds bridges, cultural bridges and sort of permanent relationships that I think in some sense, I think of it more in terms of world peace, is that you have a group of students that now are very familiar with the United States, have lived with American students, and it de-demonizes people. I think it's very successful in terms of building relationships that can't be built other ways.
How is the choice of your next president going to change the role of universities, especially in a global context?
That's interesting. And we have two very different kind of candidates. One of them, of course, the Democrat, there'll probably be very little change because the policies will be very similar, and I think the country will remain welcoming to certainly the international students. The Republican contender, who we think we know who it will be, it's less certain how students will view it. How comfortable will Muslim students, for example, feel coming to the U.S.? I think it could affect actually interest in study in the United States. It could definitely change the way students look at the opportunities in the
Right.
U.S.
And that's where the soft power comes in. How are you trying to prepare yourself for potential change?
Our feeling is that we can control our environment, and we remind students, and interestingly I had a question from a student actually in Indonesia just about what happens, sort of if the politics change in the U.S., would I still be welcome in the U.S. And I reassured them that our campus controls our environment, and of course you're welcome to come to the United States and study at UCLA. But it'll be a challenge if the politics change dramatically.
Education has always been seen as a leveler of poverty. How is UCLA helping to achieve that?
It's an escalator for opportunity. It's very interesting, given that so many of our students come from low-income families, first-generation families in America. We have a very large number of students whose parents were born in another country. So it's the place where a lot of students get their first opportunity in America to really get the skills required to be successful.
Bernie Sanders did, and part of his campaign message was to have free education. Do you think this is feasible?
It's completely feasible for a fraction of your students. And it's the fraction that need that support. It makes no sense to provide free education for people at higher incomes. Somebody has to pay for this. And there's no free education. If it's free, it means we're simply paying from taxes for it. My sense is that the appropriate model is to make sure that students with financial needs get taken care of, and students who can afford to pay for it should pay for education. So I think his program, is unrealistic.
Looking at the job market situation, there's been a lot of news recently about how bleak the situation is for graduates. Is this going to stop people from going to university? Would they think of other routes, perhaps?
So the evidence is that a university education is your surest pathway to a good career, not just a job, but a good career. And over a lifetime, a university graduate earns about $1 million more in the U.S. compared to a high school graduate. So there's no question, it's still the value proposition is still very positive. I think what you do as an undergraduate is being influenced somewhat by the job prospects. I think more students are showing an interest in engineering, in technical subjects, in the sciences. I think students that are going into humanities and social sciences, as I said, are having to be very mindful that there'll be additional educational requirements before they can really be sort of competitive for the job market.
So what advice do you give students who are finding it difficult?
So I would say, the first thing is to, prepare yourself well in college to be flexible. And because you may be working in an area that's very different than the area that you're actually being educated for. If you talk to employers, what do you hear from employers? That you want students who can think, critically, critical reasoning skills, speak clearly, write clearly, international, have language skills. Many students will change their careers 4 or 5 times during their working lifetime. If you have a good basic education, that will give you the flexibility.
Okay, I want to look at gender quickly. Are you seeing a better sense of equality between girls and boys, or women and men?
Increasingly what we find is that women are really dominating on admissions because they're arriving more mature and they've accomplished more in high school many times. So,
but do you think they carry that throughout their life though? Because if you look at the I mean, if you look at boardrooms, if you look at, companies in general, the people at the top are still men. And why is this so?
It's a challenge. No, and I think part of this is frankly discrimination in some cases, and we have to fight that. Increasingly, for university leadership, we're beginning to see more and more women. So I think it's beginning to turn around. Certainly, it's turning around in the U.S. I still notice in Asia it hasn't turned around as much. I mean, there's still many more men at meetings. We have a new position at the university, actually at UCLA, and the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity. And the person who has taken that position studies implicit bias. And people can believe they're being completely fair, looking at the credentials of a woman and a man, choose the man, not realizing that there's all kinds of biases that went into their evaluation they don't even know about. But you're right. I mean, women start off at the university in larger numbers than men. In graduate school, it begins to change the ratio. And by the time you get to the faculty, it's changed. Now all of a sudden men tend to dominate, and we've got to work at correcting that.
Can we look at the classroom of 2050, looking really far ahead in future? How will technology play a part, and do you see any other trend?
2050. Well, 2050, that's a ways off.
It is.
So clearly online education will play a much larger role. I think there'll be very few large classrooms having general chemistry lectures. You'll be coming down into class largely probably for discussion sections, and that will permeate, I think, the experience. So much of your education will be online, but I think that will not substitute for these in-residence experiences, discussions. But I think a lot of the lecture material will certainly disappear into electronic modality.
Do you see the traditional campus as becoming irrelevant eventually?
Challenging question. I don't think so, and I think that, because remember, there's more than just in-class education on a campus, and many of our alumni will point out the most valuable experiences they had were actually in student groups, leading student groups, leadership experience on campus, social interactions. There's always a lot of churn on a campus politically. That's a maturing process when you learn to deal with people who have very different political views than you. It's hard to do that online. The problem is, you got to ensure that everybody has that opportunity. And for many students with limited financial means, online education is going to be more accessible and maybe the only option they have. And that's a concern, because I think we don't want as I've said before, I've written about a reverse digital divide to form, where actually, as opposed to the earlier concern with the digital divide of wealthier students having bandwidth, all of a sudden now, poor students have plenty of bandwidth, but they're not getting a residential experience, so they're getting their education online. I think we want to avoid that.
And my last question, walls or bridges? I mean, if you're looking at the way politics is going, it seems that people are becoming more protectionist. Universities will be obviously key in keeping those bridges.
It's a challenge. I mean, I'm very concerned. I mean, if we look at what's going on in the political environment, not just in the U.S., this is really in the world, and you see the inability for people to communicate with one another, and really literally culture wars that are now going on, if you think about it. People that see the world so differently, they can't sit down and have a meal together because they see the world so differently. We've got to figure out a way to build bridges across these differences. We've got to figure out mechanisms to teach students how to speak with one another, even if they don't agree with one another. So I think if we can't do it at the university level, we can't expect when students graduate to be civil in the way they interact with one another. So I think we have extraordinary responsibility.